His lifelong emphasis, right, on studying the history of power relations through archaeology and other historical research means is legendary in our field. Definitely a pioneer in many areas of thought, as well as action or activism. He's been an inspiration. I believe I can speak for many people, including myself, to keep going in the field and find the means of instrumentalizing our political passions as well as our purposes to do some good for society as well as communities that we work with as well as the academy. He's published well over 100 different items, if you will, of various sorts, and certainly among them that are most important, a couple of the books that inspired me and so many of my fellow students in the early 90s, a co-edited volume with Robert Painter, The Archaeology of Inequality, and then shortly thereafter, A Marxist Archaeology, which is now in its second printing as of 2002, but the first printing was 92. I still remember going to the bookstore and buying that hardcover, which is still on my shelf across campus, the Little Red Book, as we called it. But excellent work there, and then, of course, in subsequent years, much more has been produced by his hands and mind. Recently with colleague Reinhard Birkbeck, right, Ideologies in Archaeology. In 2009 with Karen Larkin, Archaeology of Class War, the Colorado Coalfield Strike of 1913-14. And then 2008, many of my students are certainly familiar with this book, Archaeology as Political Action. Incredible book, and if you haven't read it, I advise you to pick it up as soon as possible. In any event, I don't want to waste too much more time coming from this voice. I'd rather have Professor Randall McGuire give us his fine presentation on activism and archaeology. Thank you.
Thank you, and thank you for having me here. I've been asked to speak with a mic because they're recording this, and so I'll try not to wave it around and use it as a club or anything. What I want to talk about today is a problem, an issue, a question that for me goes back to a statement by Mexican archaeologist Panameño and Nalda, which is Arqueología para quién? Archaeology for who? And I want to add to that question, y por qué, and why, for what purpose and what reason. And before I start really into the PowerPoint and the guts of the discussion, I need to talk a little bit about where a lot of my inspiration from this came from. In the social sciences and anthropology especially, we really like French theorists. You know, it's kind of like who is the French flavor of the month. I, however, have always found my Uncle Leo to be a profoundly insightful social theorist. My Uncle Leo was a working class guy from northern Colorado. He worked all of his life at a cement plant, all of his professional life at a cement plant in northern Colorado. And I always found that he had profound insights. One of the issues that we are struggling with right now in American archaeology, a theoretical issue, has to do with social power and what we say or don't say about it. And there has been the kind of French fad of the day right now is something called actor network theory. And actor network theory, which comes out of the work of Bruno Latour primarily, holds that we should not begin our investigations, we should not begin our questions with questions of power. That if we do so, we are predetermining what we will find. Now, of course, that therefore immediately assumes that there are significant social relations we can study that do not entail power, and that power should only come along later after we've defined the network, the actor network, after we've done that. Another aspect of this idea is the idea that objects are agents in the same sense that humans are, and that's another angle of it. And it shouldn't surprise us that these ideas are being expressed at places like Cambridge and Stanford. It shouldn't surprise us because the only people in society that can ignore power are the powerful. The only people in a society who can talk about society as if power doesn't exist are those people that have a whole lot of it. And if we want to get back to a Foucaultian distinction, I mean power over, not power to, obviously. We all have power to. That's what activism is based on. But only those people that have a lot of power over can, for a moment, entertain the illusion that power does not exist or that we can enter into any significant discussion of society without talking about it or leave it for later. Okay? And my Uncle Leo I found to be quite insightful on this because, a comment he made to me once when I was trying to explain to him some of these issues was he said, Randy, from where I sit, when I look up, all I see is assholes. Which I think is actually profound on some level. But anyway, the other thing we then need to ask, the focus of my talk here is on archaeology as activism. So, one of the things we have to ask is, how effective is archaeology as a tool of activism? And I think we need to recognize to begin with that archaeology is in fact politically very weak. Archaeologists do not command armies. We do not liberate people. We do not send people to jail. We do not engage. We do not distribute wealth or redistribute wealth. We earn very little income. Students, if you didn't know that, I'm sorry if I'm the first one to tell you that. But as archaeologists, we don't enter into these kinds of things. As you may know, the first commander of the Israeli army was an archaeologist, but those two things were totally unrelated. He was not made commander of the Israeli army because he was an archaeologist. Also, our research. If I do a accurate reconstruction of the social structure and status hierarchy of the Maya, mobs will not rise up in the street and storm the pyramids to pull down the leaders. If I do an inaccurate inference about food production among the Anasazi in the American Southwest, Mexican Northwest, people will not starve. All right? Our work simply does not have the consequences for the kinds of things that politics are usually about. We do not have, we do not affect those kinds of distributions. Political economy is the study of why, how people get what they have. So the question I put up here, if you yearn for a life on the barricades, if that's really what you want, if you want to dedicate your life as an activist, first and foremost, is archaeology the field for you? No. I have been working for last several years with a group in southern Arizona called No More Deaths. We put water out in the desert for migrants, and we also run an aid station for deportees in Nogales, Sonora. In that work, I have come into contact and worked closely with people who have dedicated their lives to activism. I have nothing but the highest admiration for my colleagues in this. But being an archaeologist is something very different. So this raises the question then, is archaeology relevant to activism? Actually, I think it is. So I'm going to maybe contradict myself here. I think it is. And again, my Uncle Leo is useful here. He gives me insights. My Uncle Leo, he worked in this cement plant. They made, where they made cement in northern Colorado. And about the end of every week, as he was leaving the plant, he'd be pushing a wheelbarrow. And that wheelbarrow had a hunk of canvas over it. And when he'd come to the camp gate, the guard would ask him to remove the canvas, and he wouldn't. There'd be nothing in the wheelbarrow, and he'd go on through. This went on for years. So my uncle was retiring, and he was leaving the plant for the last time. So he goes up to the gate, and he's walking out. Doesn't have the wheelbarrow that day. He's walking out, and the guard says, "Leo, we've known each other a long time. We're friends. This is your last day. I won't tell anybody anything. I swear it. But I have to know. I know you've been stealing something. What have you been stealing?" And my Uncle Leo said, "Wheelbarrows." Okay? So we're talking here about something that doesn't appear to be what it is. And I think this is where archaeology has its role in politics and in activism. I think we need to recognize that all political conflicts are first and foremost ideological in nature, especially when the political aspect or nature of these conflicts is covert, hidden, or obscured. The obvious triviality of archaeology, the obvious fact that we do not command armies, that we do not condemn people to jail, that we do not free people from jail, the fact that we look utterly politically irrelevant is exactly where the political power of archaeology lies. Because it makes it something we can do. It makes it a cloaked but significant political process. It is like stealing wheelbarrows. Okay? Now, the cartoon, he says, down with tyrants, and then he says, just what I need, another radical. A good friend of mine, Jordi Estevez, who teaches at the Universitat Autònoma de Barcelona, once said to me, I work in an ideology factory. And indeed, that's what a university is. A university is many things. All right, I'm not going to say it's just an ideology factory, but it's many things. But one of the things it is an ideology factory. So we have to ask, what ideologies are we going to create, and what uses are we going to put that ideologies to? So I'm starting out from a paradox. I'm starting out a paradox that archaeology is at once politically trivial and politically significant. And that paradoxically, what makes archaeology politically significant is its triviality, its obvious triviality. Now, I would also suggest to you again, because archaeologists do not free people from bondage, we do not organize people to strike, we do not, like I've said several times, command armies, etc., that archaeology in of itself, archaeological activism, is not going to change the world. That's probably true of most activism, actually. But archaeology and archaeological activism can contribute to efforts that will make a significant difference in the world. And we do so primarily in this sense of ideology and how we use that or don't use that, etc. Now, archaeology as activism, it's interesting, and I'm not sure exactly what's going on. But there's very much a sense in which, the current French theoretical fad is actor network, which tells us not to bother with power. But on the same token, archaeology as activism has become somewhat faddish. There's been a series of books around that theme, including my own. There has been a lot of talk about it. I'm going to be in an advanced seminar this spring discussing archaeology as activism. So there is a certain faddishness about it. But I think, and the idea that archaeologists, as I've said, can recognize the political nature of archaeology and explicitly advocate for communities and help those communities to create usable paths. Now, I think one of the things we need to recognize is that archaeological activism is not indeed new. That archaeology actually has been activist for most of its existence. If you accept Bruce Trigger's arguments that the origins of archaeology as a Western science, pursuit, discipline, whatever you want to call it, that those origins lie in the rise of bourgeois nationalism, an argument I would very much agree with, archaeology has served as an activist approach to nationalism from the very beginning. Probably the most classic example is the site of Masada in Israel, where for many years, I'm not sure this is still the case, but for many years, if you were an officer in the Israeli Tank Corps, you were sworn into the army at Masada, and with the call that Masada will not fall again. This is pretty loaded stuff. All right. So archaeology actually has a long history as being a form of activism in a nationalist concept. And again, its power laid in the fact that its political nature was not obvious. So, and in fact, in this political context, this nationalist context, its power lay in the fact that you could deny it was political. That the triviality of it made it possible to deny that it was political. Now, I'm not a fan of nationalism, and I'm not going to talk about that, but let me just say that just so there's no confusion here. I'm not a fan of nationalism at all, and I think that this is a misuse of archaeology. Bruce Trigger, in some of his last writings, was very critical of the use of archaeology and nationalism, and I would agree very strongly with him. We also then have, more recently, attempts to use archaeology as activism in not to support the status quo or to create a new status quo, but to challenge the status quo. And a good example of that is in Berlin, in what's been called the topography of terror. What happened in Berlin is when the Berlin Wall came down, the Berlin Wall was in the center of Berlin. And when it came down, the space the wall had occupied suddenly became very, very valuable property. If you could think about like Washington, D.C., if you could suddenly produce, a significant amount of brand new property in downtown Washington, just think of how much it would immediately be worth. And this is what happened to Berlin. And the building that had housed the headquarters of the Gestapo had been, I can't remember if the wall went over it or went right near it, but it was a building that had been torn down and the space was unusable because the wall went through. And the building was no longer there. And in fact, the only standing section of the Berlin Wall that still stands is at this spot. It was preserved as part of this museum. So activists came in and they started a clandestine archaeological dig for the purpose of excavating and revealing the Gestapo, the basement of the Gestapo headquarters, which was where people were imprisoned and where torture and executions were carried out. Basements are good for that, because they're out of sight. And they were opposed by a major corporation that wanted to build a headquarters there, and there was a long struggle, and finally the activists won, and today if you go to Berlin, you can go to the Museum of the Topography of Terror. I must make more sense in German, but that's the English translation. And you can see the basement of the Gestapo, and you can see exhibits on what was done there and things like that, and you can see the only standing segment of the wall. So we have, starting at this point, an idea of activism, of using archaeology for activist purposes that are not activist in support of the status quo, but activist in questioning it. And I like this quote from Charles Hale. I found he's at the University of Texas. I found his work quite useful. That activist research is a method by which we affirm a political alignment with an organized group of people in struggle and allow dialogue with them to shape each phase of the process, from conception of the research topic to data collection to verification and to dissemination of results. And I think there's two very important things about this quote. The first is it is a political alignment with a group of people in struggle. And what I want to talk about as I go forward here is what that entails and what challenges that presents to us and what things that changes about archaeology. And the second is this idea of a dialogue. I might say dialectic, but dialogue works too, whereby what we're doing is coming from interaction with those people, that we are moving forward and setting our agenda based on that interaction. There are some key issues and questions, and I work here off some of comments that Barbara Little made at the end of a book called Can Archaeology Change the World? I think that's the title. Is that right, Paul? Yeah. Oh, no. This is out of her critique of her article in that. She had that article in that book, Can Archaeologists Change the World? Yeah, she may say the same thing in the other book, but this is it. But I think this is very cognizant comments. I was actually, these are very cognizant comments. And I think the key one here is that if we're going to do an activist archaeology, we have to transcend the sentimentality of doing good. We can't just think that what we're going to do is we're going to go out there and we're going to do good. Isn't that great? We're good people. I'm a good person. I have good intentions. I'm sure all of you, isn't everybody in this room a good person? Don't we all want to do good by the world? All right? But there are issues that have to be addressed that make this sentimentality of doing good not adequate and, in fact, dangerous as a basis for activism. The first of these is, how do we pick which interests to serve? If we're talking about a political space, not an academic space, not a scholarly space, but a political space, which interests do we serve? There are different interests out there. And serving one may necessarily mean we don't serve another. Serving one may necessarily mean opposing another. And they might be interests that in our kind of sentimentality of doing good are good. You know, it's not just black and white out there. It's not just good and evil. What forms the basis for our judgments? Both about what we will support and what we won't support, and also about how we apply our work to it. Whose stories get told? Because really, when I talk about archaeology's ideology, we're very much about what stories we tell about people. And I won't even say about the past, because my current work isn't about the past. My current work is about the modern border wall between Nogales, Sonora, and Nogales, Arizona. But what stories we tell. So whose stories get told? Equally important, whose stories do not get told. All right? We can't tell every story. Nor, if we're serving a political purpose, do we want to tell every story. All right? This is a rejection of the idea of radical multivocality that you'll find in the work of people like Ian Hodder. The idea that we engage in a radical multivocality in the sense that we let all voices speak. And this is radical in two senses. It's radical in the sense that we accept all voices as legitimate, and it's radical in the sense that there's an implication, there is an idea that if we let this happen, radical change will occur. Well, I remember Ian was, we have a little conference we hold up, Binghampton, Amherst, a couple of other schools, called the RATS Conference. Ian was at one a few years ago, and I remember he was talking about this and kind of laying out this concept of radical multivocality. And a student of mine from Argentina who had worked on a project very much like the Topography of Terror project, but instead of it being a Nazi basement torture center, it was a military dictatorship, Argentinian military dictatorship basement torture chamber. And the student of mine, with great passion and anger, got up and said, you know, these people, the military dictatorship, took people down to this basement and they tortured and they killed them. I will not allow their voice to speak. In other words, there are some voices, if you're going to make a political commitment, there are some voices that you're taking a position that you don't want them to speak. And then what changes do we struggle with, for, and why? So all of that has to come up front. You know, we can't just go out there and go, oh, we're going to be activists, we're going to make the world a better place, and it'll be so sweet, and, you know, kind of like Bambi and something like that. We got to think about, make some hard choices here. Also then, activism is fraught, not if. Activism is fraught with paradoxes and contradictions as we approach it as a scholar. First of all, there are different approaches within archaeology. Like I said, there's been a whole slew of well, there's 4 or 5. I guess it's 4 or 5 a slew? I'm not sure how many a slew is, but anyway. There's been quite a few recent books, articles about doing it. Jerry Sabloff's Archaeology Matters, which takes a very kind of positivist point of view that we can basically learn how the world works and then engineer it to work better. Not a big fan. Barbara Little's book, which engages with ideas of civic engagement, which I think makes very effective use of both Marxist and feminist ideas in talking about common themes in historical archaeology, things like colonialism, slavery, capitalism, technological change, in terms of how archaeology can bring light on misrepresented, underrepresented, and unknown groups in these contexts. I find much that I'm very comfortable with in Barbara's work. Or, you know, if you want to go off the radical deep end, you can read Archaeology as Political Action, where I'm fairly explicit about a radical political agenda in this context. So we have a variety of approaches that have been put forth, and we can certainly talk about them. My own approach, and again, those of you who've read the book know this, because actually, originally, Archaeology of Political Action was going to be the Praxis of Archaeology until my editor said, Randy, nobody will know what that is and nobody will buy it. So we changed the title. But the idea here is that we engage in a praxis. That praxis springs from the realization that people make the social world in their everyday lives, and that we can also subvert and transform that world. that this is a possible thing to do. And I would argue that there are three parts to doing this that enter into a dialectical relationship, or if you prefer, dialogue between them. The first is knowing the world. If we try to remake the world without some concrete knowledge of that world, without some knowledge of what that world is, we're going to make mistakes because of that. We also need to critique the world. We need to ask about both on two levels. Critique it in a political sense. My earlier observations implied, if we're supporting people in struggle, whose struggle are we going to support and why? There's critique in that sense. Also critique in sense of being constantly self-critical of our own position and our own assumptions and our own, I don't want to say position again, but our own place in that world and how we benefit or don't benefit, or how we were brought forward there. And that is the essence of a critical theory, an idea that I'll return to. So we have to engage in that. And then finally, we have to take action in the world. And this is what archaeologists have done less of and talk less about, is how we take action in the world. Now, in terms of theory, those of us that, you don't have to be terribly old, but my career transcends this whole debate. But, for a long time, the debate in archaeology has been between a processual theory and what I would prefer to call alternative archaeology. So the term post-processual I would only use for the postmodernist crowd, mainly out of Cambridge and those people. I would not include feminism and Marxism in postmodernism. I mean, there are postmodernist feminist approaches and some postmodernist Marxists, but generally we've had this debate about whether we come to a subjective knowledge of the world, whether we come to an objective knowledge of a world. This debate has been going on for it's been going on since the 1980s, so if my math is right, what is that, 30 years? Yeah, that sounds about right. Anyway, it's been going on for a long time. And it is a debate that is quite tired. Archaeologists, social science in general, when we have these debates, they tend to be like a dog worrying a bone. And you start out and the bone's got some marrow in it and it's got some meat on it and it's kind of nourishing and there's some purpose to it, and then you reach the point where it's just all kind of chewed up. Or the other analogy I use is it's like a watermelon. You get a nice fresh new watermelon, you start eating on the new watermelon. It's really sweet, it tastes really good, but eventually all you got is rind. And we're down to the rind on this theoretical debate, I think. I think you still have to learn it if you're a student to understand what's going on, but I see no productive ways forward within this debate. The cartoon down is I used to hate writing assignments, but now I enjoy them. I realize that the purpose of writing is to inflate weak ideas, obscure poor reasoning, and inhibit clarity. With a little practice, writing can be an intimidating and impenetrable fog. Want to see my book report, The Dynamics of Interpreting and Monological Imperatives in Dick and Jane, a study in psychics' trans-relational gender modes. And then he says, academia, here I come. All right, so we need to get beyond that kind of polemic. So that we need a pragmatic epistemology. And obviously, we're going to come to that pragmatic epistemology from positions we start with. I'm going to be coming to it from Marxism. Many people I know will be coming from it feminism. Jerry Sabloff was coming to it from a positivist professional archaeology point of point, processual archaeology point of point, but one that makes no a priori assumptions about the value of archaeology. One thing we cannot do, clearly everything I'm talking about is working with communities. We cannot walk into a community and assume that we know the value of archaeology to that community. We need to engage in a dialogue with them and find out what they see as being the value of archaeology. We're part of it. It's a dialogue, so we don't just sit and have them tell us, because often they're not fully prepared to. But we engage in a dialogue to establish that. And we find the utility of archaeology and the relevance of what we're doing, the relevance of our research for social struggle and for social change. Another thing that I think is very important that comes out of the, or that we need to think about in relation to the old processual, post-processual debate, of course the position of people like Ian Hodder, in his idea of multivocality, is that all is interpretation. So we engage in radical action by making as many interpretations as possible, by allowing as many interpretations as possible. And we deny the idea that we can, in any objective way, decide between interpretations. I think this is a very dangerous idea. As Bruce Trigger said, true knowledge is the reformer's most important weapon, and we should never surrender it. There is, of course, the oft-quoted Quaker concept of speak truth to power. If we don't have some way of coming up with some kind of objective knowledge, that doesn't mean that we can come up with the right answer. It doesn't mean even necessarily that we can come up with the best answer. But it does mean that we can use observations of the world to eliminate some answers. All right? That our observations of the world do have some kind of weight or some kind of penetration on what we do. Ian Hodder has said that that data will resist certain interpretations. Kind of reminds me of a speed bump. Well, I think we need a little more than a speed bump. I'm not arguing that we can do what the positivists said, which is reduce everything to observations. Everything can be tested with observations. But we have to engage in the idea that we do gain knowledge of the past, or the knowledge of what we study, that knowledge does come. Because if we don't, then how can we speak truth to power? And not only that, if we don't, why should anybody believe us? More importantly, why should we believe ourselves? All right? Self-delusion is very, very dangerous when you move into a political struggle. Self-delusion can lead to consequences that are far worse than what we might be trying to address. And there's a whole history of this, especially within Marxist ideas and communist ideas, and within the body of theory that I come from. There's a whole history of self-delusion leading to some really pretty horrid and awful things. Now, there are contradictions that we have to deal with if we're going to engage in this. Contradictions in what we try to do. And here is where I think an activist archaeology has to break with a critical theory. And that is, the first is that as activist scholars, we have dual loyalties. We have a loyalty to the academy, to knowledge and theoretical production and innovation, but the political struggle is not so much a struggle of ideas or how we think about the world. It's a struggle with pragmatic and practical results. So the criteria for evaluating these things can be very, very different. How we evaluate our results, how we evaluate what we have done, can be very, very different in the academy versus in the political stage. I mean, one of the places that this is probably most obvious is if we talk about essentialism. We are charged not to. I mean, all contemporary social theory says we should not think in essentialist terms. But every political struggle I've been involved with has an essentialist base in terms of it. So these kinds of contradictions. Also, the political process is compromising. It is compromising in the sense that, the old truism, the essence of politics is compromise. It's also compromising in the sense that to accomplish pragmatic results, you may have to compromise other things in yourself and in your thoughts about the world. This takes challenges. I think one of the most difficult one for many people, and the one I get kind of critiqued the most on, is if you're going to engage in political action, you have to take sides. And for scholars who are trying to come up with a critical view of the world that considers all the options and considers all the negatives and the positives and all, taking sides can be very difficult and can be very threatening. Because taking sides means after you've done that evaluation, you actually have to say, okay, this is what I'm going to do. And if this has any consequences, then it's important. If it has any consequences for people. The other thing we have is if we're going to speak truth to power, what do we do if our craft, what we discover, what we learn from our craft. What do we do if that does not fit to the political agenda or to what the people we're working with thinks? Do we conveniently lie to support a political agenda? If we do that, we're not speaking truth to power. If we do that, we are engaging in self-delusion. In the Ludlow Project, to give you an example, I was told by many times by people in the community, at the Ludlow Massacre, 1914, won't go into a lot of details here, but 2 women and several children smothered to death in a cellar under a tent that was burned over them. One of the women was pregnant, very near term. And many people in the community, it's widely believed in the modern community, that the National Guard ripped her belly open with a bayonet and hoisted the fetus up on the end of the bayonet. I am as convinced as I can be that this never happened. I'm convinced of this because I have the orders that the National Guard was given, and I know they were not issued bayonets. There are hundreds of pictures of the National Guard. There are no bayonets in any of the pictures. There was an autopsy performed by the county coroner on the woman after her death with a union representative present, and no contemporary account makes any mention of this. So I'm quite convinced this did not happen. But then I'm faced with the problem of how do I deal with that in my discussions and conversations with members of the community that we're working with, which is a unionized commission. Essentially, and the other problem is essentialism. Essentialism is often essential. Essentialism is essential, yeah, okay. To mobilize people, to get people to identify with a cause and to move and work for that cause. But we as scholars in contemporary social theory deny essentialism. It's essentialism, So some people have advocated that we need to take a situated or situational essentialism. In other words, go to it in the political concept, but not still continue to theorize and talk about it. However we deal with that, we are in a uncomfortable position. And I would argue that we want to maintain that discomfort, that it's very important that we not be comfortable in this kind of thing. Also, political action and activist scholarship requires closure. You're usually working towards a goal, whereas critical theory and academic scholarship often is thought to be better left open-ended. So there's another tension. And finally, there's the issue of solidarity. And I've received quite a bit of, there are a lot of people object to my ideas of solidarity. Maybe some of them come from the fact that I am a union member and I work with, a lot of my work has been focused with unions. But the idea that if you were going to engage and struggle with people, our commitment to them has to go beyond the research we're doing. It has to go beyond to being standing in solidarity with them in other aspects of their life. And my example of that is that a colleague of mine on the Binghampton campus came to me and asked me to sign a petition to get the power plant on campus to stop burning coal. He was taken aback, because I'm a good lefty. He was taken aback when I told him I could not sign the petition. And the reason I could not sign the petition is because I worked with coal miners. I was building my professional scholarly career on work with coal miners. I had entered into their struggle, and I was in solidarity with their struggle, and I could not sign a document or a statement that would cost them jobs. And that was my decision in that context. Now, I'm not actively advocating for burning coal, and I know that clean coal is an oxymoron, and I'm not going to argue against that. But by the same token, I'm not going to work against it. I mean, there are many, many places I can invest my time in activism, and so I've chosen not to in this one. But solidarity sometimes means we have to make compromises in our own efforts, in our own perspectives, and all for this. So this kind of scholarship is not just a matter of applying science to struggle. That's what Jerry Sabloff kind of argues. And it's much more complicated than just kind of assigning science to struggle. It involves dialogue, it involves dialectic, It involves a constantly shifting field. It involves a constant uncomfortableness, a constant tension. And I would argue that engagement with struggle can lead us to profoundly different knowledge and understanding. There's no doubt in my mind that in our analysis of the Colorado coalfield strike, that our work directly with the unions did do that. So I think it is something to engage in, and this is actually a high point of that effort when the site was made an historic landmark. It is the only national historic, it is the only labor history site that is a national historic landmark in the United States. And this was something that was significant to the people involved. So I have to go back to my Uncle Leo and ask about what should we do in the future. And I think we should take his advice, and his advice would be steal more wheelbarrows. Thank you. I've gone on a bit longer than I planned, but I think there is time for questions if anybody has any. Yes?
So you spoke a little bit about essentialism being important to mobilize people, and situational essentialism as one sort of concept. Can you give maybe an example of that?
Well, I mean, a lot of examples come out of working with indigenous people. I mean, for example, I just did a project where we arranged the repatriation of a bunch of some ancestors, and some looted artifacts have been taken from a Yaqui battlefield in 1902 by Alex Harlichka, and we arranged for it to come back. But they have a very essentialized notion of what it means to be Yaqui. And something that Clifford what's Clifford's first name? James Clifford has suggested is a distinction between what he calls essentialism and cultural integration. So in this kind of case, if we look at the Yaqui, they'll argue to you that there's something essential that makes them Yaqui, and this would run contrary to the kind of current theory, the way we look at culture and stuff. On the other hand, there is no question that there is an integrated cultural reality to Yaqui. I mean, they're people. They live in communities. They have governmental organization, etc. So that would be the idea. And the idea of situational essentialism is, it depends on how it's applied. But in some cases, it comes down to just setting aside our concerns about essentialism if we recognize some legitimacy to the people we're working with. I think Clifford's solution is a better one. In other words, we can distinguish between essentialism in the sense that, that there's something, essential to people that make them Yaqui, and instead ask the question, does Yaqui form an integrated cultural reality? And, I could argue quite easily it does.
We have a microphone here for any other questions, and we have quite a bit of time, so okay. Please throw any questions out there.
Okay.
I think you said everything, yeah.
Okay. Well, thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much, Randall, for coming to the conference. It's been a real pleasure to have you here. The conference isn't over yet. We have 2 more sessions that are starting back over in the Mary Graydon Center. We have HIV by the Wire, presentation from Towson University, workshop style, and then an interview with Barbara Kroger about undercover ethnography and undercover journalism. So there's quite a lot of meaty stuff left to dig our teeth into. There's bagels and coffee over there as well. So if you want to make your way over, we'll see you then. Thank you.